So yeah, I will be talking about my PhD work where I try to understand the importance of secondary animal product consumption as well as food industry that may have shaped the regional interaction system of the Indus civilization. Uh, just one second. But before I start my presentation, I would like to thank all the collaborations and supports that I have received throughout my PhD, before my PhD, and even after my PhD. There are numerous people, I cannot name them all. There are numerous institutes, universities, uh, and organizations who have funded this research, who have helped me analyze the sample, who have given me access to labs and facilities. So great kudos to them and thank them for their support. Uh, so in terms of understanding regional interaction as well as food industry, I think it is very important for us to first decentralize Indus civilization and take Indus civilization apart into small regional pockets where these regional pockets were so important that on one hand, this regions within Indus region have maintained a very strong local interaction while at the same time maintaining a kind of global interaction with other Indus regions. And the only way we can identify such sort of interaction is when we try to look them in their own context from the eye of their individuality rather than looking from a broader Indus or Harappan perspective. So this is kind of an approach that I have taken for my PhD, where focusing more on a region. So the region of my focus was primarily on the region of Kutch. My PhD was focused on this one particular settlement, Kota da Badli. The reason I have chosen this settlement is that this is a very tiny settlement. So this is the settlement where it is located. The yellow highlighted part is what we have excavated. This is the boundary wall of the settlement. This is our excavation camp. We got a satellite image when our camps were laid on. So this is a settlement uh, of Kota da Badli, and it is located at the confluence of two rivers. Uh, Dr. Prabodh has talked a lot about this settlement, its findings, its importance, and all those aspects. So I'm not going deep into those aspects, like what other crafts and things that we have found from the site. But this site was interesting on a point that this is a very small settlement, mostly containing regional tradition rather than displaying all the central Harappan traditional items. There are no evidences of crafts or non-perishable craft at the settlement in terms of craft production. So this settlement appeared to be very interesting for me, and I have spent years excavating this settlement. So I started working on this settlement, asking a single question that what would have been the function of the settlement and how this particular settlement situated itself within this regional network between different settlements, regional network between different hierarchical settlements, where in Kutch we have settlements as large as Dholavira, we have towns like Khirsara, we have very specialized manufacturing settlements like Shikarpur, and then we also have these small settlements that are basically not doing anything when we only consider non-perishable items that we might have discovered from the site, but we didn't find any. Um, in terms of its temporality, this settlement was occupied somewhere between 2300 and 1950 Cal BC. The AMAs that I obtained from the charcoal samples at this settlement dated between 2400 and 1900. Um, so in terms of charcoal sample, it was pretty interesting that even though we have had a lot of ash at this settlement, there were really not a great amount of charcoals in terms of large charcoal. So we had very few tiny charcoals, and our dating had to rely on those tiny pieces of charcoal samples as well as a few pieces of charred dung. Um, In terms of the major findings at the settlements that were primarily constrained to animal remains as well as pottery. So these are the most of the thing that we have found at the settlements, apart from a very fairly well built boundary wall and the central residential structure. And Prabodh has told earlier that there are spaces between the residential structure and the fortification or slash boundary wall where there's no sign of occupation in terms of residential structures. So when we looked into the animal remains at the settlement, what we found is that the cattle and buffalo, the large domesticated animals, lived past their adulthood. The majority of the animals lived past their adulthood, where we say 60% of them lived past their adulthood, which was exactly opposite for goat and sheep, where we see 50% of them died when they were young. Now, this is not a new finding. We have seen similar pattern almost every Harappan settlements. We have found so much of animal bones from these settlements that we now know that animal meat played a very major role in Harappan diet or across the Indus civilization. We have also found traction marks on various animal bones, and we know that these animals were used for traction not only as a marker on bone, but we also have crafts. We also have depictions that have showed us that these animals were important not only for their meat but also for their power. Now, one thing we really did not know is that how these animals were raised, and the other aspect of animal domestication or animal utilization is to what extent these animals were exploited for their dairy. So these are the two questions that I raised for my PhD and for my research, because again, uh, raising an animal would depend on how you would utilize the animal. So the utilization of the animal would determine how you'll raise it. The utilization of the animal would determine how you interact with the animal when the animal is alive. The utilization of the animal would also determine how would you interact with the animal when the animal is dead. So this importance to the animal would shape how the entire human animal as well as the environmental interactions that may have developed. So in order to understand how these animals were raised in this particular settlement, what I try to understand is what kind of fodder these animals consumed when they were alive. Um, so at present, so I have done carbon isotope analysis of dental enamel from the settlement of Kotadabadli. Chase et al. Have done similar studies at other multiple sites, including Bagasra, Shikarpur, and Jadak. So interestingly, we see a very similar pattern in Gujarat. And that pattern is that cattle buffalo were raised slightly different than the other animal categories such as sheep and goat, where we see that cattle buffalo were primarily raised on a C4 dependent diet or slightly heavy C4 diet, while sheep and goat or goat in this particular sense were raised on a very C3 heavy diet. Now, this is also the nature of these two animals because cattle are grazers, so they graze mostly on the grasses, whereas goats are mostly browsers, so they mostly browse on leaves, and majority of leaves are C3, so they would uh, show a C3 signature where because grasses there are grasses that are C4 would indicate a C4 signature. But this is important, particularly for Gujarat, because the C4 that is coming up as a fodder, a major portion of those C4 were actually coming from agricultural millet, because we know that millet has been a major crop during the Indus civilization in Gujarat. We can see a lot of millet, a lot of agricultural fodder was provided to cattle, and also to some extent to some of the goats and sheep when the fodder were fresh and green, because otherwise goats would probably not eat a lot of grass and when they have access to fresh leaves. So when we look at settlements like Bagasra, Shikarpur, and Jadak, the settlements are quite bigger when compared to Kotarabadli. We see that they kind of had a source, a a constant source of C4 in terms of agricultural fodder. So it's not only that agricultural fodder was provided to these animals, but it's also at the same time that agricultural fodder was stored for a year-round supply, which is true and not true in case of Kotada Budli, because in Kotada Budli we see a quite an influence of C4 type fodder, but we can also see that there are seasonal variation where depending on the availability of fodder, some wild grasses and the grasses that generally grow naturally around the vicinity of the settlement were also incorporated into their diet. Uh, this particular pattern is also important that I'll come later into my presentation, but I would just give a brief insight to that. Is that this isotopic signature of the animals is not only visible in their tooth enamel, but any of their carbon isotopes, any part of their body or any part of their system would have similar signatures. So it's not only that dental enamel, but when I'll talk later, I'll talk about food residues, liquid residues. This signature would also be important, and you'll see that how this signature has helped me to understand some of the practices and patterns. Uh, Now, I have seen that, or we have seen that at Kotada Badli, cattle had been given a slight edge over sheep and goat, where fodders were selectively stored for them, where agricultural fodders were selectively given for them. I also wanted to know if these animals that we see at Kotada Badli were raised at Kotada Badli, or they were coming from all over. Now, there has been a notion, although not so prominent, that during the Harappan period, a lot of these pastoral communities were mobile in nature. Now, if we are seeing Kotarabadli as a seasonal settlement, or if you're seeing Kotarabadli as a mobile settlement where occupation was not continuous, or where at least a portion of the occupants were moving seasonally or moving up to a greater distance with the animals, then we would expect to see a lot of variation in terms of strontium isotopes for these animals, which would the strontium isotopes are directly indicative of the of the region, the geology that these animals generally roam around and eat food from. So when we look at the strontium samples from Kotada Badli, you'll see that all our samples, or majority of our samples, fall within a range between 0.7094 to 0.7096. Now, this 0.0002 variation is kind of expected for a particular settlement. But if there are a lot of movement, and if there are a lot of seasonal movement, and if there are a lot of animals coming from different regions, then we'll have a much wider variation. We have some animals that fall slightly above and below our average of the settlement. But then again, we have to remember that Gujarat, particularly Kutch and Gujarat, is a very complex it has a very complex geological setup where isotope values change like within a few kilometers. The strontium isotope values might change because the bedrocks are so different. uh, but when we look at the settlements like Bagasra, Shikarpur, and Jairab, uh, our settlement matches quite well. Our average values, if you just compare with Shikarpur, matches quite well with Shikarpur, because they are again located in the same geological region. But at the same time, there are a lot of variation in these settlements. So these settlements indicate that it's not only that there were animals raised at the settlement, but there were also animals that were coming at the settlements from different regions. So animals were born somewhere else, and they were transported to these settlements before they were consumed. Now, this sort of movement of animals, for cattle buffalo, especially for cattle buffalo, because the movements are wider for cattle and buffalo, even in case of my samples, wider for cattle and buffalo, but not so wide for sheep and goat that are mostly raised locally. Now, this sort of movement of animals, especially for cattle and buffalo, is not only present in Gujarat, but if you have read the work done by Benjamin Valentine, he has also shown that along with female that were migrating from one settlement to other settlement, maybe for a marital purpose or some other purposes, probably were also carrying animals with them. And this is the way that animals were moving between settlements. So it is possible that a major source of the meat at these settlements were coming from different settlements, or it is also possible that along with human, animals were also moving at these settlements, and that's why we can see such variation. However, this was not the case at Kota Dabadli because we don't see such an extent of variation. Some seasonal variations are possible at Kota Dabadli because, again, so this one particular sample that you see is quite a different value from our average of our settlement. Now, this animal could be because the Banini grassland from Kota Dabadli is not too far. But when we compare their strontium isotope composition of Banini grassland and the area around Kota Dabadli, we see such kind of variation, and the values around Banini grassland is quite high, close to the values we observed. So if some of the animals were seasonally moved or moved on a weekly or daily basis to Banini grassland to acquire grass, particularly in seasons where agriculture was not so prominent or there were not a lot of agricultural fodder available, we can expect seeing similar values. So in general, the values we observed at Kota Dabadli were very local, very regional to Kota Dabadli. Uh, Now, when we looked at the oxygen isotope, again, we see that all our cattle, buffalo, and sheep, goat had experienced a very similar oxygen isotope values. Now, say for example, if animals were coming from coastal area to the settlement of Kota Dabadli, we will see a different oxygen isotope values. Like now, I didn't put a comparative diagram for Kota Dabadli and Bagasra and Shikarpur that are most coastal, had a very different oxygen isotope values than what we observed at the settlement of Kota Dabadli. So these oxygen values will change if we see that many animals are coming from different hydrological weathers. At the same time, when we compared our oxygen isotope values with our carbon isotope values, if the entire diet of the animals were seasonally varied, then we'll see a strong seasonal signature. Say, for example, when the rainfall will increase, say, for example, they will have more access to more C4, or when the rainfall will decrease, they will have more access to C4, and when the rainfall increase, they would have more access to C3 because the way the cultivation pattern was going on during that time. But we don't see such kind of a strong interrelation. Like there are some samples where we see a very strong interrelation because, as I said, that some animals were seasonally dependent and were also consuming agricultural fodder and locally available fodder. But then there are also animals where we don't see any seasonal dependence, and those were the animals that were constantly consuming agricultural fodder that were stored for them, irrespective of their time of presence or time of production. This again supports an argument or suggest a process where these animals were raised locally within a settlement, not having access to an excessive amount of agricultural fodder or an excessive amount of agricultural waste that can be fed to these animals rather than, or at the same time, it's also possible that they had such a huge number of herd or such a huge number of animals that it is not practical to feed all those animals with agricultural fodder stored at the settlement, because then that would be a lot of agricultural fodder. Say, for example, you have like hundreds of cattle. So can you imagine like how much agricultural fodder you have to store? And in that case, it is more feasible to feed them with agricultural fodder when they're available and wild fodder when they're available. So it is a less burden for the resident of the settlement. Now, once we realized that, okay, these animals raised at the settlement of Kota Dabadli were raised locally, so they were not migrating with the animals, not that animals migrating from different regions were coming to the settlement of Kota Dabadli. We found a very interesting a feature at this settlement. Now, Dr. Prabodh has talked briefly about this deposition of ash. Now, this deposition of ash at this settlement is quite interesting. But this is not only one settlement, or this is not only the settlement where we have such a deposition of ash. There are other settlements where we have seen such deposition of ash. Now there are archaeologists who have argued that yeah, these were the ash probably produced during the production of craft. Some argued that maybe the interaction between Sorat and the traditional Harappan were not so peaceful, so there were burning of the settlements and all those stuff, and that created such kind of ash. Especially because we see this kind of ash, especially when we start seeing an increased utilization of Sorat type materials. Now, this ash is interestingly located only along the fortification wall, so or the settlement wall. I have to get rid of that term, fortification wall. So this is a settlement wall, and we have seen this dumping of ash along this settlement wall, whereas we don't see such ash anywhere within the residential structures. Now, this also indicates that this area around the settlement of was used as an area to dump this ash, occupational debris, ash, and other things, while just to maintain the cleanliness of the settlement. Now, in order to understand that what was the fuel that has given rise to this kind of a ash deposit, and if you can imagine, this is a 3.5 hectare settlement, and it has this boundary wall, all the four sides, and then you have a few meters of ash deposit along the fortification wall, along the settlement wall, both inside and outside. You can imagine that the quantity of ash we are talking about. So it is not the amount of ash that a settlement can generate by just domestically producing ash through domestic use of hearth. So we are talking about a lot of ash, and this ash is not only appeared after the settlement was well built, but we also see the presence of this ash underneath the settlement wall. So this is a lot of ash, and as I said earlier, that we don't see large pieces of charcoal. So this is a very fine ash that we see. So I carried out a phytolith analysis of the ash, and what I found that all the samples that I have collected from ash contains very high amount of phytoliths, mostly phytoliths from monocots, phytoliths from grasses, compared to phytoliths from dicots and wood. Uh, I also looked into dung spherulite, the presence of dung spherulite at this ash. Now, in combination of phytoliths and dung spherulite can actually give you a better answer if any of those ash was actually a result of burning animal dung, because most of the time herbivorous animals, ruminant herbivorous animals produce these spherulites in their gut, and then they excrete them with their dung, with their feces. And when you burn those feces, because these spherulites can survive up to 800 to 900 degrees, so they generally preserve in archaeological context until unless the soil is very acidic, which is not the case at Kotara Budli. So we found this dung spherulite at this ash deposits, and as you see that all of our ash samples had pretty high content of dung spherulite, indicating that a lot of this ash was coming from burning of dung, along with probably burning of some of the unused fodder, some of the grasses, maybe other occupational debris or day-to-day debris that they generated while residing at the settlement. Uh, we also have to remember that when we're talking about this ash, it is not that they might have had some sort of oven or big hearth where they were carrying out craft activities that produced this ash and they were dumping this ash. It is also possible that they were just dumping the dung, which if they had a lot of animal, which might have produced a lot of dung, and they had to get rid of dung because they cannot use all of that dung to fuel and to manure fields, but to just get rid of those dung, they were burning those, they were dumping those dung, and then occasionally burning the dumps that gets accumulated in this area. Now, it's not only at Kotarabadli where we see the evidence of using dung as a fuel or burning dung. Carla Lancelotti has done a lot of studies, and she has also found the evidence of dung burning at multiple settlements in Gujarat. So this is nothing new, and it is quite likely, as in an area like Kotara Budli, where wood is not easily available, and when you have animals and when you have this dung that can be a great source of fuel, and they were using them as fuel, is perfectly acceptable and perfectly expected. Um, so now, when we looked into the phytolith, the other interesting thing that appeared is that even though it has all these various types of grasses from all these different environments and ecologies, there are no evidence of grain processing at the site. So there are no phytoliths that would indicate that threshing or winnowing activities were carried out at this settlement. Now, this is also in par with other evidences, because at this site, even after extensive amount of flotation, we did not find any grain, any grain or weed that would account for the presence of grain processing at the settlement. So it is likely that they were not processing grain. So it is possible that they were processing grains not within the settlement, but somewhere outside of the settlement and bringing the grains in. It is also possible that they were not producing any grain or not producing a lot of grain, rather than they were getting those grains from their nearby settlements through some sort of exchange. Uh, Now, so these are the different phytoliths that we have found as deposits, and these are some of the spherulites that I have found in those as samples as well. Now, again, coming back to the same slide, so phytolith counts are very less for the uh, inner side of the residential area, and that also indicates that they probably done a great job cleaning this site and removing all the waste. And again, the phytoliths within the residential areas are mostly dicot phytoliths compared to the monocot phytoliths that we have seen in the ash deposit. So it's again, so this phytoliths is not a very uniform phytolith distribution. So it is a very complex phytolith distribution that indicates that it's not probably one source, but there are multiple sources that was responsible for such kind of phytolith distribution at this settlement. Uh, Now, the third part of the study was where I looked into the lipid residues for archaeological ceramics. So now we have seen that how the animals were raised at this settlement. We have seen how what sort of waste those animals might have generated. We have seen how those waste were managed, but we know that these animals were used for traction. We know that these animals were consumed for meat because if you remember from Pankaj's presentation, that he has found a lot of animals with a very strong marks of traction. So we know that these animals were used for purposes other than meat. But one thing we did not know is that if those animals were used for dairy, and even if at all dairy was a food that Harappans consumed, because to date the evidence we had in terms of dairy consumption were mostly speculative, based on some of the pottery analysis that okay, this pottery, the shape of the pottery might indicate that this pottery contains some sort of liquid, and it could be possible that it was dairy, because there are ethnographic data that similar sort of pots were used to process dairy. So we didn't have a very clear direct evidence of dairy. Now, some may argue that, well, when you have cattle that are living beyond their adulthood, meaning that those animals were used for secondary purposes along with their meat, and then when they're using for secondary purposes, so it is likely that they were used for both traction and dairy. Yes, it is likely, but the but the but the standard distribution or standard mortality pattern that is associated with extensive dairy consumption is not what we found in the civilization in general. So it is not that only female cattle lived past their adulthood and all the male cattle were slaughtered when they're young to maintain the herd size. But at the same time, we see that even male cattle live past their adulthood, so which is more in lieu with the thing that these male cattle are used for traction. So just based on the mortality pattern, it is not possible to exactly interpret that these animals were used for dairy. So then my search began for dairy. at this settlement, we analyzed 59 shards. So we have taken different sorts of pottery. So there were bowls, there were cooking vessels, there were pots and jars, there were channel handled hemispherical bowl. Now these sort of bowls are very typical to Gujarat, to Kutch. You don't see this kind of bowls in other places of Indus Valley. So it's kind of a bowl with a handle. So this is a very there are numerous evidences from Kanmer. There are numerous evidences from Shikarpur. Some people call them ladle. JP Joshi called them channel handled hemispherical bowl. So I just continued with that nomenclature. I analyzed perforated vessels, and there were also hole mounted lead that I analyzed. Uh, Interestingly, all of the samples that we analyzed contained some amount of lipid in terms of residues, and the concentration varied from 5 microgram to 262 microgram. This is kind of a standard that we see even other parts of the world. Like this is the standard contained of lipid residues. Apart from instances where you have exceptional preservation, or you have very fresh samples that produce lipid residues in milligrams, which are very unlikely. So this is kind of what is expected. So there is no reason to believe that the preservation of Indus material are bad. No, they are not bad. At least not for Kutch, Gujarat, or from again from Haryana, because one of my colleague, she also found a good amount of lipid residues from that part of the Indus civilization as well. So yeah, we have considerably better preservation, and so in terms of variation within vessels, what we have seen, the bowls and cooking vessels have the maximum variation. So bowls and cooking vessels have vessels that had very little amount of lipid residues, so little that an interpretation is not possible, to a very high concentration of lipid residues where an interpretation is absolutely possible. So you see that for my bowls and for my cooking vessels, this range varies from 5 microgram to 260 microgram, and 6 microgram to 59 microgram. Now this also indicates that these bowls and cooking vessels were not particularly used for one particular food, but they were used for different food items, some of which contain high concentration of lipid, some of them contain a very low concentration of lipid, and that's why we see similar variation. Pots and jars, they have very little variation. They kind of have the amount of lipid residues that is possible to interpret, but sometimes it's not possible to interpret. Um, and this is quite expected, because if food were not processed in those vessels, and if those vessels were occasionally used with high lipid residue, high lipid content food, so this sort of expression is possible. Now all the ladles or hemispherical bowls that I have talked about contained considerable amount of lipid residues, and I'll show what sort of lipid residues those vessels produced. Now this has indicated me, or this has suggested me a very interesting thing, is that there's a possibility that these ladles or these bowls has an use of a measuring system. So when we talk about Indus measuring system, we mostly talk about weight, but so that's based on weight, but then there was this measuring system based on quantity. So like how much grain I'm giving, or how much liquid product I'm giving. So where it is not always measured in terms of a standardized weights, but it is the shape, or the or the or the amount of liquid, or things that a pot can hold is the actual measuring system. Now, Professor Kerr have talked about a similar measuring system in the civilization, and possible existence of similar measuring system, and how this measuring system can be regionally monitored rather than very pan in this way of monitoring. So a measuring system that we can see in Kutch, in Gujarat, or in this particular area of the Indus civilization may not or need not to be true for the other regions as well. So I have a feeling that these vessels could be used. So these vessels could be used as some sort of measuring utensils, but at the same time, this could be just serving bowls and serving spoons. So this is too little to interpret anything. At the same time, we don't have intact vessels of this sort that we can reconstruct reconstruct the shape and the amount that these vessels can hold, and if there is any sort of standardization. So it's not possible, but this is a possibility that we can look in the future. Um, Now, when we looked into our lipid residue profile, so just based on the distribution of lipids and Western distribution of fatty acids, what we have seen that there are different sorts of food items that are cooked, consumed, and processed at this settlement. So we have evidence of aquatic fats, so probably coming from fish. Now, as I said, the settlement of Kota Tabadli is located in the confluence of these two tiny rivers, seasonal rivers, of course, but they may have occasional access to fish, and they were consuming the fish, and we have now data evidence that yeah, they were consuming fish. We also have plant residues, probably oil, sort of oil. So they have different oil seeds that they have used, so they were using some sort of oil. At this point, I wasn't able to identify what exact oil it is, because I need a standard modern collection in order to go beyond and identify source of this oil, these oils. But the majority of lipid residues present at this settlement were coming from animal meat and milk, or a mixture of animal meat, milk, and some sort of plant lipids, which also indicates that these animals were possibly cooked in the presence of some sort of plant oil, probably a very modern way of cooking meat. Because when we see our next slide, so these are all of our dairy sample. Now, if you remember, I told you earlier that C4 signature that we see in the cattle would be helpful for me to interpret my lipid residue data, and here it is. So the carbon isotope values of the lipid residue that we extracted indicate that all these lipid residues were coming from animals that were predominantly or increasingly consuming C4 type diet compared to a more C3 type diet. And we have seen that in case of Kota Tabadli, these were cattle and buffalo. So all the dairy that we have observed at this site were coming from cattle and buffalo. And if you see the pure C3 diet area, we don't have any indication of dairy. So it is likely that sheep and goat were not consumed for dairy and consumed for meat, while cattle buffalo were consumed. One of the use of cattle buffalo were to produce dairy. Now, these are the vessels or the reconstruction of vessels that produced the residue signature of dairy. So we have cooking vessels, we have bowls, we have perforated vessel. We also have this ladle that produced some sort of dairy signature. Now, we also have to understand there's these bowls and these ladles were used for multiple purposes, because most of them are serving vessels. So maybe in one occasion they were given, they were used for dairy, but the other occasion they were used to maybe to serve khichdi. So the residue will change, and that's why there are some mixing is possible, especially for this kind of serving vessels or measuring vessels where this mixing is also possible, that sometimes it does not fall exactly where it should be or it's supposed to be, or where it is expected to fall. So these are some of the vessels that produced dairy, and again, the dairy were coming from cattle. Now, these are the ceramic that produced meat. So again, when we look into the meat, so what we find that there are a lot of meat that were coming from sheep and goat, uh, mostly goat in this case, because sheep is again not a major domesticated animal during in this period in Kutch. So a lot of them are coming from goat. We also have meat that were coming from cattle. We also have meat that were coming from non-ruminant animal, and in this case, possibly coming from porcine or pig, maybe from wild pig that they have hunted. There are also possible that some other animal meats are also present in this category. So it may look like that these are all goat. They need not to be all goat. Any ruminant animal that consumed a C3 dependent diet would produce similar signatures. So it can be goat, it can be deer, it can be nilgai, or any other ruminant animal that you can think of were consumed during the Indus period would produce this kind of signature. But this is where it is interesting, because as these animals, as this meat were coming from animal that consumed C4, and C4 are coming primarily from agricultural fodder that were given to cattle. So these are the meat that were coming from cattle and buffalo. Now, you might ask that in terms of the distribution, you see the cattle meat are not so predominant at this site. Now, this is expected because if you imagine a cattle, killing a cattle would produce such amount of meat that you would probably not consume cattle meat on a day-to-day basis, especially for settlements like Kota Dabadli, where maybe 50 or 60 people were residing at the same time. So that would be a waste of animal. So maybe in some special occasions, in some ceremonial occasions, or in some special situations that they have, or in some feast and parties, they have consumed cattle. But otherwise, day-to-day household cooking, they probably preferred a goat meat over cattle meat. um, so we have this large basin that also produced, so this is the large basin. So that also produced lipid residues indicating of porcine meat. So again, we have cooking vessels that indicate that uh, meat were cooked in those vessels. So we have indications that meat were heated because of the distribution of fatty acids. So meat were heated, dairy were heated. We have perforated jars. So that also indicates that dairy were processed to some form other than just consume meat as a raw milk. So milk were heated, milk were processed in a different way. We have meat, that meat were cooked, meat were also processed rather than, so meat were cooked in globular pots, so they were not always roasted. So some of them were probably processed in the form of gravy, also in the presence of animal fat and maybe other spices as well, and maybe some vegetables as well. But it is difficult to entirely reconstruct the culinary practices just based on the lipid residues, because as I said, a pottery may have a longer span of use, and the residues will be a mixture of all the use, or some of the use rather than just one particular use. So there are some mixing happening as well. So we also have to keep that in mind. Uh, but we then have, but again, if now if you see the pottery types that we have for meat versus the bowl types that we have for dairy, they looks different. They are different. They are not the same bowl that were used for dairy and that were used for meat. So these bowls are smaller. These bowls are much thinner, much beautifully made compared to these bowls that are much crudely made. So it is not possible for me at this point of in time to identify if there were a specialty bowl made to consume milk or milk products or dairy products, and specialty bowls prepared to process or consume meat products. But as we see this sort of a difference, there is a possibility that in future we will be able to, with more samples, we'll be able to understand pottery function in a much better way. An aspect of Indus civilization, an aspect of Indus pottery that has been rarely discussed in terms of how Indus vessels were used. People have tried, people have attempted. It's not that people have not attempted, but those attempts were primarily consisted of the understanding of pottery engineering and the ethnographic comparison, rather than looking at the actual use in terms of use wear analysis or in terms of residue analysis. So this has a future potential. Now the question comes that what this settlement were doing. Now Pramod has told in his earlier presentation that this was probably used as a caravanserai. I have a different interpretation of what I think. So it's not that I'm contradicting him, but this is my interpretation. So these small settlements, sedentary in nature, have raised a lot of animals, and these animals were actually provided them with surpluses. Now, when we talk about surpluses, what sort of surpluses these animals might have provided? So they were probably provided with traction power. We have evidence that a lot of animals animal found at Kota Dabadli had indication of traction. So they were used for traction. They were used for their skin when they're dead. Dairy, obviously, because we have seen dairy, we have seen such a huge amount of dairy from the settlement. We have seen different processing practices of dairy. So dairy is another aspect that this settlement might have produced beyond their household consumption, for amount enough for exchange. They may have also provided manure to the nearby cultivating lands, because this is a the this is a very very cooperative and collaborative interaction between agriculturists and pastoralists. Even it is true today. You can see that sometimes herders, they just go and feed on agricultural leftover in an agricultural site, and what the agricultures get in return is the dung or the feces that this animal leaves when or the animal excretes when the animals leave the site, and this kind of provide them with this organic manure. And I'm sure inorganic manure was not a thing during in the civilization. So they may have provided these agricultural settlements with manure, and obviously meat. When you have such a number of animal, you can trade animal, you can exchange animal between settlements, and that can provide meat to these specialized craft producing settlements and towns where you have a lot of mouth to feed, and you need a lot of food for that. Now, the question would be then what this settlement would have got in return. So first, what they have got by developing this interaction with a neighboring town-like settlement is economic security, social security, and political security, as well as access to market, access to specialized, in a specialist in terms of craft specialist and other specialists. So all those kind of support that these small rural settlements received from the urban settlements or more urban settlements, while urban settlements received these food staples from these rural settlements. What the settlement might have got returned again, maybe grains, because as I said, the grains were not produced in a large quantity at the settlement, so they were probably received processed grain in return, access to pasture land. So as I said, a lot, because they were not doing, if they were not doing a lot of agriculture, in order to get access to the agricultural leftover, they might have to rely on agricultural settlements, and in return, so they may have given them manure or dairy or meat or some animals, and in return they got access to the pasture lands. And again, the other thing that we can see at the settlement, the non-perishable aspect of this interaction are the crafts. So majority, 99% of the crafts that we have observed at the settlement with Katarabadli are finished goods. So they are not workshop goods where we have indications that these crafts were made at the settlement, but not, these crafts were received in exchange because they are all finished and they're all coming from different regions. So now when you have contact with a settlement like Khirsara, say for example, where crafts are coming from all over in the settlement, and where crafts are going from all over Gujarat through Khirsara to all these settlements, settlement like Kotarabadli getting access to all these different kind of sophisticated crafts are not difficult. So this is where they were getting these sort of crafts, and in return of the product that they produced, as well as pottery. So it is also possible that the neighboring settlements who were more focused on making pottery were giving them pottery in return of their animals' products. So this is sort of an interaction that may have been possible during the Indus period in this area of the Indus civilization. This interaction was definitely not hostile in nature. Not that people were killing people in order to access goods or access to land. Again, not only crafts, but they may also have access to raw materials because when you may have larger settlements may have access to such raw materials that smaller settlements may not. So, for example, that we have seen that some shell raw materials were coming to the settlement of Kotarabadli were possibly coming through those exchange networks rather than a person from Kotarabadli going down to the coast and picking up those shell objects or shell raw material and coming back to Kotarabadli. So this interaction was very cooperative in nature, very collaborative in nature. They were not fighting with each other, rather they were supporting each other. This interaction is not only necessary, this symbiotic relationship is not only necessary for them to survive, but you imagine when there are downtime, there are climatic downtime, there are trade downtimes. These interactions help them to survive and pass through all these hurdles, because there was a diversion or there was a breakage of economic specialization, that not everybody is doing everything, but there are specialized people doing some part of thing, and there are other specialized people doing some part of thing. And that's why when one aspect of this network got hit by some sort of calamities, not the other aspect did not get hit similarly, and that's why they were able to survive for such a long time, even in a harsh climate like Kutch that we have experienced. Um, then during the late period, why this settlement of Kotarabali disappeared and it was not occupied or continued occupation, it's primarily because this kind of occupational specialization was not needed when other occupational specializations have disoriented. So when settlements like Khirsara, Kanmer, Shikarpur were not so much invested into craft production, uh, they could produce their own food, and they don't need a settlement like Kotarabadli to provide them food. And again, Kotarabadli has now then less interest in providing them food because they would not get anything in return, the things that they were getting and that were getting. So there was no need for them. So this is one of the reasons that these settlements, these smaller settlements, disappeared primarily during the middle of late mature Harappan phase and the late Harappan phase, because there's probably no need for this kind of interactions. So this is my interpretation what the settlement of Kotarabadli was doing and what probably the strong regional interactions were there. Kotarabadli not necessarily had any sort of interaction or any sort of connection with any other Harappan settlement from any other Harappan region. They probably had an entire connection with Khirsara, and that was enough for them to receive whatever they have received. Uh, so, so, so I think there are possibilities in future to look into those sort of interaction and to understand Harappa from its root rather than uh, looking through the things that are very shiny and bright in nature. Um, so this is the end of my presentation.